He wonders if memory has a sound. For him, it's not gunfire. It's the sound of wind rushing into a vacuum. The sound of a city breathing its last. And beneath it all, her voice whispering a name that wasn't his. It's 1968. He's in his garage in Ohio. The air smells like cut grass and gasoline. Safe. His hands, thick with calluses from a life of quiet work, strike a match. The scrape of sulfur, the hiss of the flame. He doesn't light the cigarette. He just watches the small fire eat the wood. The smell, sulfur and burning pine. In an instant, the garage dissolves. The lawnmower is gone. The sunlight is gone. He is no longer Jack Riley, 45 years old, father of 2. He is 21. He is underground. The air is thick with plaster dust and the smell of so many people, terrified in the dark. The cellar. He can't see her. He never really saw her. Not clearly. But he can feel her, the shape of her shoulder pressed against his arm, in the absolute, suffocating blackness. He feels the vibration through the stone walls before he hears the sound. A low, tearing groan that doesn't come from the sky but from the earth itself. The bombers were high, miles high, but he felt them in his teeth. He opens his hand in the garage. The match has burned down, nipping his skin. He lets it fall. He survived the fire, but he never left the cellar. His mind jumps, not to the fire, to the cold. December 1944, the Ardennes. He wasn't a hero. He was just a grunt in the 106th Infantry. The Golden Lions, a name that felt like a sick joke now. They were green, so damn green. Fresh off the boat, their uniforms still smelled of the States, of wool and mothballs and a world that was already a memory. They'd been told this was a quiet sector, a ghost front. The ghosts turned out to have Panzer tanks and the coldest winter in 50 years on their side. The cold was a living thing. It didn't just bite, it chewed. It got into your bones and set up shop, a permanent aching tenant. He remembers the sound more than anything. Not the gunfire, not yet. The sound of the trees cracking, not from the wind. The sound of German 88 splintering ancient pines the size of telephone poles. A sound like the earth itself breaking its own bones. He remembers the foxhole. It wasn't a hole. It was a grave dug in frozen mud, a shallow scrape in a world that had turned to iron. He shared it with Billy, the kid from Boston who'd lied about his age. Billy, who'd talked for 3 days straight about his girl, Susie, and the ring he had tucked away in his pack. Billy, who cried so silently his tears froze to his cheeks, tiny, glistening tracks that caught the weak morning light. Jack would look away, give the kid that much. They were told to hold the line. A line on a map, drawn by men in warm rooms far from the sound of cracking trees. But the line had vanished by the second day. It was overrun in hours, swallowed by a grey-green tide that moved through the fog with a terrible, practiced inevitability. He didn't fight bravely. There was no room for bravery. He just existed. He became a machine of survival. He fired his M1 Garand until the receiver glowed with a dull, cherry-red heat in the twilight, the ping of the ejected clip a brief metallic sigh before he reloaded. He threw grenades at shadows in the mist, the explosions muffled by the snow, the concussions felt in the teeth. He did it because the man next to him was doing it, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering you were cold and scared and probably going to die in this godforsaken forest. Then silence. It was the silence that was the most terrifying. The German artillery stopped. The small arms fire sputtered out. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the skeletal branches, a high, lonely sound. Then a new sound, the deep guttural rumble of engines behind them. They were surrounded. The sound grew closer, until it wasn't just behind them but all around, the metallic clanking of tracks on frozen ground. A voice, amplified, metallic and unnervingly calm, cut through the snow. It came from everywhere and nowhere. Für euch ist der Krieg vorbei. For you, the war is over. One by one the men stood. They rose from their holes like ghosts, their hands going to their heads. Jack looked at his rifle, the wood stock scarred, the metal hot. It felt suddenly useless, a stupid, heavy piece of metal. He opened his hand and let it fall into the snow. It didn't make a sound. A German soldier emerged from the tree line. He wasn't a monster. He was a boy, maybe younger than Jack, his face pale and pinched with cold under his coal scuttle helmet. He gestured with his machine pistol for Jack to move. Their eyes met for a second. The German's eyes weren't angry. They weren't triumphant. They were just tired. A deep, bottomless exhaustion that mirrored the hollow feeling in Jack's own gut. as tired as he was. That was the moment. That was the day he stopped being a soldier. The fight, the purpose, the idea of being a golden lion. It all just drained out of him, leaving nothing but a cold, empty shell. He was no longer a man with a rifle. He was cargo, to be moved, processed, and stored. He fell into a column of other silent, shuffling men. He didn't look back at the foxhole. He didn't look back at Billy. He just put one foot in front of the other, his head down, marching into a captivity that felt, in that moment, like a perverse kind of relief. The war was over. His war, at least. And a new, quieter kind of hell was just beginning. They marched. It wasn't a march of men, but of ghosts. A shuffling, broken column of grey faces and frozen feet. They moved past the ruins of Bastogne, and the sound of artillery from the town was a dull, persistent thunder. A war they were no longer a part of. Other men, braver men, were still fighting in that frozen hell. Jack just put one foot in front of the other, the shame a low burn in his gut, colder than the wind. He was a spectator to his own war now. They marched until the snow under their worn boots turned to a grey, filthy slush. Then the slush gave way to the deep, cloying mud of central Germany. The world had lost its color. It was a study in grey and brown. His dog tags tucked beneath his shirt were no longer metal. They were a slab of ice against his sternum, a constant, shivering reminder of the name he no longer felt he owned. When they finally stopped, it was beside a train. A line of cattle cars, their wood stained and reeking. The smell hit him first. Ammonia, from the animals that had been there before them. And beneath it, the sharp, sour tang of human fear. They were packed in, elbow to elbow, back to chest. There was no room to sit, only to stand and sway with the lurch of the train. The doors slid shut with a final metallic shriek, plunging them into a near-total darkness, pierced only by thin slivers of light between the boards. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time lost all meaning in the constant rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the stifling heat of packed bodies, the shared bucket in the corner that became the focus of their collective humiliation. Men prayed, men cursed, men wept silently. Jack just stared at one of the slivers of light, watching the German countryside flash by in fragmented glimpses. He was cargo. That's all. Human freight being moved to a warehouse. When the doors finally screeched open again, the blast of cold, fresh air was a physical shock. He stumbled out, his legs buckling, his eyes burning with the sudden light. He blinked, expecting barbed wire, guard towers, the familiar geometry of a prison camp. He didn't see a camp. He saw a city. It was beautiful, impossibly heart-stoppingly beautiful, untouched. He hadn't seen a building without shell holes in months. The spires of churches and the ornate domes of old buildings pierced a soft grey, quiet sky. The air smelled of coal smoke and frost, not cordite. It was a postcard, a pre-war dream. Dresden. They were formed into a ragged column and marched through the streets. The civilians stopped to watch them, women in heavy coats, old men with canes. He braced himself for it. The hate, the spit, the shouted curses he'd been taught to expect. But it never came. The faces that turned toward the line of broken, filthy American prisoners were just blank, hollowed out. Their eyes held no anger, only a deep, resigned weariness. They were spectators too. They were just watching another shipment of the doomed pass through their beautiful, doomed city. The war was already lost. Everyone knew it. Everyone but the men still giving the orders. They were herded across the Elbe, the river serene and cold, and into a complex of large yellow brick buildings. The Schlachthof, the old city slaughterhouse. The irony was a blunt, ugly instrument. Their new home was a place built for the processing of animals. The heavy gates clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing in the vast open yards. And that's when he saw her. She wasn't in the cellar yet. This was the day before. She was a civilian across the street, pulling a small wooden wagon with one wobbly wheel. She was wrapped in a dark coat, a scarf over her hair. She stopped, not to stare, but because the column of prisoners had halted her progress. She looked at them, not at the group but at the individuals. Her gaze swept over the exhausted, vacant faces. Then her eyes found his. They weren't pitying. They weren't even sad. They were recognizing. It was a look of pure, unadulterated knowledge. Like she was seeing men she already knew were dead. Their bodies just hadn't received the message yet. It was a look that saw through the uniform, through the dirt, through the Americanness of him, and saw the hollow core. She saw the cargo. He held her gaze for a second that stretched into an eternity. In that silence, on that clean, cold street, they exchanged a single terrible truth. "I see your end." Then she looked away. She adjusted her grip on the wagon's handle and kept walking, disappearing into the flow of the city. She was gone, but he never forgot that look. It was the first human connection he'd had since the surrender, and it felt like a verdict. In that beautiful, untouched city, waiting for a fire he couldn't yet imagine, her eyes had been the coldest thing he had ever felt. Colder than the Ardennes, colder than the dog tags against his skin. They were the eyes of the future, and they held no hope at all. The screen door of the garage creaked open, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. 1968. His wife, Mary, stood silhouetted in the frame, holding a glass of iced tea that wept condensation. "Jack, you've been out here for an hour. Supper's almost ready." He blinked. The world swam. The phantom scent of plaster dust and ozone dissolving, replaced by the solid, safe aroma of roast chicken from the kitchen. The cellar walls receded. The terrified press of bodies vanished, leaving only the oil-stained concrete of his garage in Ohio. "Just thinking," he said, the words feeling thick and foreign on his tongue. She stepped inside, her eyes doing that quick, familiar inventory. They scanned the workbench, the lawnmower, and finally settled on the burnt matchstick lying like a tiny black bone on the floor. She knew, of course she knew. She was a good woman, practical, kind. He loved her. He loved the green and yellow lawnmower, the 30-year mortgage, the steady hum of the refrigerator that promised perpetual abundance. He loved the whole, carefully constructed architecture of this piece, but he knew with a certainty that was as much a part of him as his own skeleton, that he was a ghost in his own home, a curator of a life that belonged to another man. Mary moved closer, her hand coming to rest gently on his shoulder. The same shoulder, the exact same place where, in the absolute blackness of a collapsing world, Anna had leaned the weight of her terror and her trust against him. The contact was a lightning strike, a synaptic bridge between 1968 and 1945. He flinched, a full-body recoil he couldn't suppress. He tried to shape his face into a smile. It felt like a crack in dry clay. "Just tired," he offered, the lie as automatic as breathing. "The cold's getting into my bones today." Mary's hand fell away. She nodded, her expression soft, accepting. But her eyes, the eyes that had looked at him across the breakfast table for 20 years, were deeply, profoundly sad. It was 80 degrees in Ohio. The evening air was heavy with the smell of cut grass and barbecue smoke. There was no cold. He watched her turn and walk back to the house, the screen door sighing shut behind her. The silence in the garage was different now. It was no longer the silence of memory. It was the silence of the present, and it was accusing. His mind, treacherous and unbidden, replayed the real. Not the firestorm, not the sound of the city dying, but the quiet before, the march through Dresden, the way his boots had echoed on the cobblestones. A sound so clean and precise after the muffling snow of the Ardennes. He remembered the Schlachthof, the slaughterhouse. The irony of the name hadn't been lost on him even then. They were herded like animals into a place built for the processing of animals. And her, the woman with the wagon, she had been a still point in the chaos. Her dark coat, her scarf. She had looked at him, and her gaze hadn't been one of hatred or even curiosity. It had been a look of pure, chilling recognition. A coroner identifying a body. "I see your end," her eyes had said. And in that moment he had believed her. He had felt the truth of it settle in his gut, colder than the frozen mud of his foxhole. Now, in his safe garage, he understood. Her look wasn't a prophecy of his death. It was a diagnosis of his life. She had seen the hollowed-out man he would become. The man who would carry this cargo of guilt and memory for decades, a ghost haunting the pleasant rooms of a house in Ohio. He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. They were the hands of a husband, a father, a man who fixed things. But beneath the calluses, he could still feel the raw, bloody scrape of the coal chute. He could still feel the impossible searing heat of the iron door. He could feel the moment her grip had slipped from his wrist. Live. He had followed that order with the same numb obedience he'd followed all the others. He had built a life on top of her grave. Every board of this house, every laugh from his children, every quiet moment with Mary, it was all built on the foundation of that single, cruel command. The weight of it was immense, a geological pressure that had been compacting him year after year. He stood up, his joints protesting. The burnt match was still there on the floor. He didn't pick it up. He walked to the door and looked out at his backyard, at Mary moving behind the kitchen window. He loved this life, he did. But love, he had learned, was not a shield against memory. It was just another room in the house, and the ghost was in every room. The firestorm had never ended. It had just gotten quieter and moved inside him. He was on a work detail, hauling rubble near the Hauptbahnhof. The main station was a skeleton, its grand facade pockmarked and scarred from an earlier, smaller raid. The work was brutal, mind-numbing. Haul the broken bricks, stack the splintered beams. The German guards, old Volkssturm men with faces as worn as their ill-fitting uniforms, barely watched them. Their war was already over. They just didn't know it yet. Then the sirens began. It was a sound he'd heard before, but never like this. This wasn't the warning cry for a single squadron. This was a sustained, rising and falling shriek that seemed to come from the very stones of the city. A chorus of the damned. It was late, past 10 p.m. The world was ink black. The city huddled under a strict blackout. The old guards panicked. They weren't SS fanatics. They were grandfathers, shopkeepers, men pulled from their lives and given a rifle they could barely lift. Their authority evaporated. Schnell! Schnell! One of them yelled, his voice cracking with a fear that was instantly contagious. They abandoned the rubble pile and shoved the prisoners, a dozen ragged American POWs, toward the nearest public shelter. There was no fight left in anyone. Survival was the only order. They ran down the steps into the earth. The air changed instantly. It went from the cold night to a thick, damp chill. The cellar was huge, a stone-vaulted cavern that felt ancient, a relic from a safer time, and it was packed. The smell hit him first. Unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the faint, sweet scent of fear. He saw mothers clutching children to their skirts, their faces pale moons in the gloom. Old men stared ahead, seeing nothing. They were all pressed together, a single trembling organism. He was shoved from behind, stumbling deeper into the human mass. He lost sight of the other POWs, and then he was pressed against her. He recognized the shape of her coat, the set of her shoulders, the woman from the street, the woman with the wagon who had looked at him with those knowing eyes. The impact was jarring. He muttered, "Sorry," the English word feeling foreign and useless. She turned her head. In the dim, jaundiced light of a single emergency bulb, he saw her face clearly for the first time. She was young, maybe his age. Her hair was pulled back, but strands of it had escaped, framing a face that was all sharp angles and quiet intensity. She had no color in her cheeks. She said nothing. Her eyes just held his for a moment, and in them was a profound, unsettling calm. It wasn't defiance. It was acceptance. She had already mapped out all the possible endings to this night. Then the world ended. The first wave of RAF Lancasters arrived. It didn't start with a whistle. It started with a tremor, a deep vibration that came up through the soles of his boots and into his teeth. The ground didn't just shake, it jumped. The single light bulb overhead vanished with a tiny, pathetic pop. Total absolute darkness. It was a blackness you could feel, a physical weight on the eyes. The sound followed, a tearing, ripping roar that was beyond sound. It was pure force. The stone walls around them groaned. Plaster dust rained down, filling his mouth and nose with the taste of pulverized history. The screams began then, not from outside, but from within the cellar. High, sharp, and utterly helpless. He lost his balance. Or the floor moved. He wasn't sure. He was falling. No, the whole world was falling in on itself. His mind screamed one word. Direct hit. This was it. This was the hole in the ground they'd all promised themselves. And then he felt it. A hand, small, frantic. It brushed against his arm, then grabbed his wrist. The grip was surprisingly strong. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. His own hand, calloused and dirty, closed over hers. He held on. He held on like she was the only solid thing in a universe that was coming apart at the seams. He didn't know her name. He didn't know if she had a husband, a brother, a sweetheart. He didn't know if she loved music or hated the taste of turnips. He knew nothing. But in that absolute, suffocating blackness, with the symphony of hell playing above them, they were anchored. Two enemies, a boy from Ohio and a German nurse, holding on to the last shred of the world by holding on to each other. For the next 6 hours, as the city above them was systematically erased, they did not let go. He didn't know how long the first wave lasted. Time had become a substance, thick and syrupy, measured only in the frantic beat of his heart and the pressure of her hand in his. When the last bomb fell, the silence that followed was somehow louder, more terrifying. It was a void, a held breath from the city itself. "What's your name?" His voice was a croak shredded by dust and fear. The air was a foul soup of plaster, sweat, and the first faint tendrils of smoke. A beat of silence. Then, Anna. Her voice was soft, clear, no accent in that single word. Just a voice, a human sound in the inhuman dark. Jack. The cellar was a tomb. The bombing had stopped for now, but the building above them was a furnace. He could feel the heat now, a palpable force pressing down, seeping through the stone. It was the heat of a foundry. The air grew heavier, tasting of burnt sugar and things he didn't want to name. They talked. Not about the war, not about Hitler or Roosevelt. There were no sides down here. There was only the dark and the heat. He asked her what she did. I am a nurse, she whispered, the correction a small, defiant act of hope. At the Frauenklinik, the women's hospital. Your family? Gone, she said, the word flat and final. On the Eastern Front, my brothers. He said nothing. What was there to say? The words "I'm sorry" were obscene. He was part of the machine that had ground them up. He told her about Ohio instead. About the farm, the endless rolling green, the way the corn looked in late July, a sea of life. He told her about the creek where he'd learned to swim, the water so clear you could see the stones on the bottom. She told him she'd always wanted to see the ocean. The real ocean, not the Baltic. She wanted to stand on a shore where the water went on forever, with no end in sight. They weren't American and German. They were just Jack and Anna, a boy and a girl in the dark, building a tiny, fragile raft of words to keep from drowning. The screaming from the floors above them had stopped. That was the worst part. The silence that replaced it was a different kind of sound. It was the sound of absence, the sound of a future being erased. Then a new sound, a different sound cutting through the oppressive quiet. Not the high-pitched falling whistle of the British blockbuster bombs. This was a deeper, guttural hum, a vibration that started in the bones and worked its way out. It was the sound of a vast mechanical swarm, the B-17s, the flying fortresses, the Americans, his planes, the second wave, the daylight raid. A strange cold clarity washed over him. This was the plan. The RAF by night to terrorize, to create the firestorm. The USAF by day to finish the job, to bomb the ruins. They were targeting the rescue services, the survivors staggering into the light. They were targeting him. The cellar buckled. This wasn't the shuddering impact of a single bomb. This was the earth itself convulsing. A section of the stone ceiling, ancient and massive, gave way with a sound like a mountain breaking. Dust and debris exploded into the space, and for a terrifying second, a hellish orange light from the world above flickered through the chamber, illuminating faces frozen in a final, silent scream. Anna didn't scream. She just tightened her grip on his wrist, her small, strong fingers locking with his. Her other hand came up, gripping his forearm, anchoring him. In that fleeting, infernal light, he saw her eyes. They weren't wide with terror. They were focused, resigned. They held his, and in them he saw not a plea, but a shared, grim understanding. They had found each other in the darkness, and now the darkness was coming for them all. The roar of the planes was deafening, a promise of annihilation written across the sky. He held onto her hand, the only real thing left in a world being unmade, and waited for the end to find its mark. The world became heat and pressure, a physical weight, not of stone, but of the air itself turning to poison. The main exit was gone, buried under a mountain of fire and melted stone. The screaming had stopped. That was the worst of it. The silence that was left was not quiet. It was absence, the sound of a future being erased. Jack was fading. His lungs were on fire, each breath a shallow, useless sip of grit and smoke. He could feel his consciousness narrowing to a single bright point of pain. People around him were slumping over, not from injury, but from the air being stolen from them. They were drowning on dry land. We can't stay," He gasped, the words tearing at his throat. "The air," Anna whispered, her voice a rough scrape. She was a nurse. She knew the physiology of death. The fire. It's pulling the air from the shelters. It's breathing for itself. She knew. She knew they were suffocating. He felt her let go of his hand, and a moment of pure animal panic seized him. To lose that anchor in the dark was to be lost forever. "No, this way." Her voice changed. It was no longer the soft voice from the dark. It was clipped, commanding. She wasn't a civilian anymore. She was a triage nurse in a city that had become one giant casualty. She was in charge. Her small, strong hand found his arm and pulled him, a blind man being led through a panicked, dying crowd. He stumbled over legs, over soft, unmoving forms. "Where?" he croaked. "The coal chute. For the old furnaces. It's old. It might be blocked, but it goes up." She found it by memory, her hands reading the wall like a map in the absolute black. A small iron door set low in the stone. It was scalding hot. He heard her hiss as she touched it. Then the sound of fabric as she used her coat to grip the handle. She pulled. The rusted hinges screamed, a sound that was somehow more human than the silence. A rush of superheated air, thick with the smell of burning pitch, hit them like a physical blow. It was the breath of the city, and it was dying. "You first," she coughed, shoving him toward the opening. I can't leave you here." "You are a soldier," she said, and it wasn't an identity, it was an order. A function. "Go." He scrambled into the narrow shaft. It was a tight, vertical coffin lined with broken bricks and soot a century old. He clawed his way up, his fingers tearing on jagged edges, his boots searching for purchase in the dark. He was a worm burrowing upward through the guts of a dying beast. He pulled himself toward a faint, flickering orange light above. It wasn't salvation. It was just a different kind of damnation. He was climbing out of his own grave. He reached the top, his hands bleeding and black, and hauled himself over the lip of the chute, rolling out onto a surface that was unstable and hot. It wasn't a street, it was hell. The air was gone here too, replaced by a swirling incandescent storm. The fire had its own weather. Winds, hot enough to blister skin, howled through the skeletons of buildings, whipping flames into tornadoes of orange and white. The sound was a constant low roar, the voice of a god made of pure consumption. He saw the asphalt under his feet. It wasn't solid. It was bubbling, a black, sticky tar. The world was melting. He looked back down the chute, into the darkness that had held them. Anna grabbed my hand. The light from the burning city lit the shaft like a furnace door. He saw her halfway up, her face a pale mask of soot and strain. She was struggling, her body twisted. "I can't," she coughed, the words swallowed by the roar. "My leg. It's stuck." He reached down, his arm stretching, fingers straining, but she was too far. The distance was only a few feet. It might as well have been a mile. "Jack, the air, go, go." The German word was a slap. "No, I'm not leaving you." He was screaming now, the heat scorching his throat. "You must." Her voice was frayed but absolute. He saw it then. The fire wasn't just around them. The fire was the air. A firestorm, a term he would learn later in a quiet library in Ohio, a word that could never capture the reality. A man-made hurricane of flame that sucked the oxygen from a city, from its shelters, from its lungs. He saw the asphalt bubbling beside him. The world was coming apart at the seams. "Look at me," Anna cried out from the hole. Her voice cut through the inferno's roar, a thread of pure will. He looked down. Her eyes found his in the flickering, terrible light. They held him. They were calm. They were giving him his orders. "You will live," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a final, desperate transmission. Anna. Her name was a prayer, a curse, a sob. Live. The building beside them, a grand structure that had stood for 200 years, gave up its soul. It groaned, a sound like a giant dying. The wall bulged, then collapsed inward, and a river of fire and shattered masonry poured over the mouth of the coal chute, sealing it with a final deafening crash, sealing her inside. He screamed her name, but the firestorm just roared back louder, swallowing the sound, swallowing the memory of the sound, swallowing everything. The garage. He keeps a small metal box on his workbench. Mary thinks it holds old medals. He opens it. There are no medals, just his dog tags and a torn photograph. It's not of Anna. He never had a photo of Anna. It's of his platoon, before the bulge. Billy from Boston, who could make the whole squad laugh by imitating their top sergeant. Sergeant Miller, who had a wife and a newborn son he'd never seen. Chunk Peterson, who shared his last chocolate bar the night before the Germans came. All dead. He survived the Ardennes. He survived the Panzers. He survived the firestorm that killed 25,000 people in one night. Why? He looks at the smiling faces in the photo. They were frozen in a moment of ignorant hope, thinking the war would be over by Christmas. They were better men than him, braver. He wasn't saved. He was left behind. A piece of cargo that had fallen off the truck, forgotten in the mud, while the real goods were delivered to their fate. He picks up the dog tags. The metal was still dull, the stamped letters and numbers a permanent scar. He remembers the heat in the cellar. The feeling of that metal searing his skin through his sweat-soaked shirt, a brand he couldn't remove. He closes the box. The click of the latch was a sound from another world. He was a good grunt. He followed orders. He moved when they said move, shot when they said shoot. But the only order that mattered, the one that echoed through the decades and into this quiet, safe garage, came from her. Live. He could still feel the grit of Dresden on his skin, a phantom grime that no amount of soap and hot water could ever wash away. The ash had gotten everywhere. In his eyes, his mouth, the seams of his uniform. It was the ash of everything. Of buildings, of books, of people. Of Anna. He remembered stumbling away from the sealed chute, his mind a blank slate of shock. The city was a single roaring flame. He walked past a streetcar, its metal frame twisted into a skeletal sculpture. The bodies inside reduced to shadows on the seats. He saw a woman sitting perfectly upright on a curb, holding a bundle of rags that might have been a child. Just waiting, he kept walking. There was no up, no down, just the fire and the ash. He found himself at the edge of the Grosser Garten, the city's great park. The trees were blackened sticks. In the center of a scorched lawn, a stone statue of some forgotten composer stood, untouched amid the carnage, his stone eyes gazing serenely over hell. Jack sat at its base, his back against the cold marble. He was shivering, though the heat was blistering. An old German man in a tattered Wehrmacht coat shuffled past, saw his American uniform and stopped. The man didn't reach for a weapon. He just looked at Jack with a bottomless exhaustion, then wordlessly offered him a sip of water from a canteen. Jack drank. The water tasted of smoke and metal. The man nodded and moved on. There were no sides left, only survivors. Days later, when the Russians found him, a young Red Army soldier with a pockmarked face and a submachine gun poked him, thinking he was a corpse. When Jack looked up, the boy jumped back, then laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. He offered Jack a cigarette. "Amerikansky?" Jack nodded. The soldier gestured at the smoldering ruins and said something in Russian, his tone one of grim awe. Jack didn't need a translation. He understood. They had all done this. Together. Now in the garage, he ran a thumb over the cool, dented surface of the metal box. He had built a life on top of that ash. A good life. A life of lawnmowers and suppers and PTA meetings. He had loved Mary. He did. He loved the solid, simple truth of her. But he had married her with hands still stained from the fire, and he had built their home on a foundation of a ghost. Every time he kissed her, he was remembering the taste of toxic air. Every time he held his children, he was remembering the weight of a life he couldn't save. He was a monument to a secret. The dutiful husband, the reliable father, the man who fixed things. But inside, he was still that boy, climbing a coal chute, his hands bleeding, his lungs burning, following the last order he would ever truly respect. Live. He hadn't, not really. He had just carried the war home in his bones, a quiet, smoldering prisoner. The firestorm never ended. It just turned inward, burning on a fuel of memory and guilt, a silent, eternal flame for the woman in the cellar who had given him a future she would never see. He closed his eyes. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. A safe sound, a sound of peace. But for him, it was just the quiet roar of the fire 23 years later and counting. He looked back down the chute. "Anna, grab my hand." The light from the burning city was a false, hellish dawn, illuminating the narrow shaft in flickering orange and black. He saw her halfway up, her face a mask of soot and sweat, her eyes 2 points of fierce, desperate light. She was struggling, her body twisted at an awkward angle. I can't, she coughed, the words tearing from a raw throat. My leg, it stuck. Something had shifted in the collapse below, a timber or a fallen stone, pinning her ankle in the darkness. He stretched his arm down, his shoulder screaming in its socket, fingers splayed, straining. He could almost feel the heat rising from her. Almost, but she was too far. An inch, a mile. It didn't matter. The distance was impossible. Jack, the air, go, go! Her voice was a ragged command. No, I'm not leaving you. His own voice was a stranger's, high-pitched with a terror that was not for himself, but for the space that was about to open in the world where she existed. You must. He saw it then, truly saw it. The fire wasn't just around them. The fire was the air. It was a firestorm, a word he'd learned later in a clean, quiet room, a sterile term for this living hell. A man-made hurricane of flame that sucked the oxygen from the city, from the shelters, from human lungs. He saw the asphalt on the street not 10 yards away, melting. It was bubbling like a thick black stew. The very ground was coming undone. Look at me, Anna cried out from the hole, her voice cutting through the roar. He forced his eyes from the nightmare above and looked down. In that soot-streaked face he saw a terrifying clarity. You will live, she said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a hope. It was an order, delivered with the final authority of someone who had nothing left to lose, but this one. Last thing. It was the last piece of her will given to him. Anna. Her name was a prayer, a curse, a sob. Live. The building beside them, a skeleton of a house that had been standing for centuries, groaned. It was a sound he felt in his teeth, a deep, resonant cracking, the sound of a giant dying. The wall bulged inward, then gave way completely. A river of fire and debris, timbers, furniture, molten glass, poured over the mouth of the coal chute like a wave of lava, sealing it with a final, deafening crash. Sealing her inside, he screamed her name, a raw, animal sound that was torn from the deepest part of him. He scrambled forward on his bleeding hands and knees toward the spot where the chute had been, but the heat was a physical wall, pushing him back. He screamed again, but the firestorm just roared back, louder, swallowing his voice, his grief, his very reason for being. He knelt there, on the melting street for how long he never knew. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the fire and the absence where Anna had been. A German soldier, his uniform in tatters, stumbled past, saw him and kept going. There were no sides here anymore. There was only fuel for the flames. He finally pushed himself to his feet. His body moved, but Jack Riley was gone, left behind in that cellar. What remained was a shell, programmed with one last command: live. He turned his back on the sealed tomb and began to walk. He didn't know where. Away from the heat, away from the epicenter of his failure. The city was a landscape from a fever dream. The air was thick with ash, falling like black snow, coating his tongue, his teeth. He walked past shapes that had once been people, now reduced to shrunken charcoal statues, frozen in their final moments. He saw a pram, its metal frame warped, its contents unspeakable. He saw a woman sitting perfectly upright on a curb, holding the hand of a child who was no longer there. He was a ghost among ghosts. The sound was the worst of it. Not the crackle of the fires, that was a constant like the ocean, but the silence that lay beneath it. The silence of a city that had run out of screams. He walked until his legs gave out, collapsing on the banks of the Elbe. The river flowed black, reflecting the inferno, a ribbon of oil and fire. Dozens of others were already there, sitting in the same stunned silence, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They were all looking at the same thing, the colossal churning pillar of black smoke that rose into the sky, a funeral pyre for 25,000 souls. For one soul, he sat there and the guilt began to settle. It was a physical weight, heavier than any pack he'd ever carried, filling his lungs, pressing on his heart. His planes had done this, the B-17s, the flying fortresses with their proud, star-spangled wings. His side, the men he had trained with, the country he had fought for, had unleashed this. They had saved him from the panzers only to deliver him to this. And the one person who had offered him a moment of pure, uncomplicated humanity in the midst of it, who had anchored him to something other than the machinery of death, had been taken by the very force that was supposed to be his salvation. He wanted to die. The desire was a cool, clear thought in the madness. To just walk into the river, or back into the flames. It would be so easy. It would be right. But then he heard her voice. Not a memory, but an echo burned into the fabric of his mind. Live. It was the cruelest command he had ever received. It was a life sentence. He lay back on the ash-covered stones, the heat of the city warming his back, and stared at the poisoned sky. He was alive, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that this was only the beginning of the punishment. He doesn't remember the next few hours. He just walked. He was a ghost in a city of ashes, a specter moving through a landscape that God had abandoned. The heat was still immense, radiating from the piles of rubble that glowed with a malevolent orange heart. He walked past bodies, or what was left of them. They weren't people anymore. They were small, blackened, shrunken things, curled into final fetal protests against the heat. He saw a pram, its metal frame warped and melted, and he had to look away, his stomach clenching into a cold, hard knot. He walked past German soldiers who didn't even see him. A young private, his uniform torn, was just sitting on a chunk of masonry, staring at his hands and crying soundlessly. The hierarchy of war was gone. The neat lines of enemy and ally had been erased by the fire. There were no Americans, no Germans, no Russians. There were only the dead and the ones who had to watch. He was one of the watchers. His punishment was to see. He stumbled over something soft. He looked down. It was a book, its pages charred, the leather cover bubbling. Next to it, a single, unsinged porcelain doll's head stared up at him with vacant blue eyes. The world had become a gallery of obscene still lifes. He made it to the river, the Elbe. It wasn't water anymore. It was a sluggish black sludge choked with ash and debris, reflecting the inferno on its banks in oily rainbow swirls. He collapsed on the stones, his body giving out all at once. He was just one of hundreds now, a congregation of the damned sitting on the banks, all of them staring with the same hollowed-out eyes at the same thing, the colossal, churning pillar of black smoke that rose into the sky. A funeral pyre for 25,000 souls. For one soul. He looked at his hands resting on his knees. They were caked in grime and dried blood from the coal chute. His uniform was in tatters, the wool stiff with soot and sweat. He was still an American soldier. The thought was a sick joke. He thought about the planes. Not the low, moaning Lancasters of the night, but the high, silver specks of the B-17s in the clear afternoon sky. His planes, the ones he'd cheered for back in England. The ones with the stars he was supposed to salute. They had flown over mile after mile of them, a beautiful, terrible armada in the clean blue, and they had methodically, surgically, turned a city into a crematorium. His side. He had been saved by an enemy civilian, a woman who owed him nothing, who had shown him a fragment of grace in the absolute dark. And he had watched that grace be incinerated by his own army. The math of it didn't work. It was a debt that could never be balanced, a sin that could never be confessed. The guilt was a physical thing. It wasn't an emotion. It was a substance. It settled in his lungs, a fine black dust that he knew he would breathe for the rest of his life. It was heavier than the smoke, denser than the stone dust from the cellar. It was the weight of her last look, the finality in her voice when she gave him the only order that mattered. He wanted to die. The desire wasn't dramatic. It was a simple, logical conclusion. To just stand up and walk into the black, viscous water of the Elbe. To walk back into the still smoldering ruins and find a quiet place to lie down. It would be so easy. It would be right. It would balance the scales. One life for another. His for Anna's. But then he heard it. Not a memory, not a thought. An echo burned into the very marrow of his bones. A vibration that had traveled from her lips through the superheated air and into him, forever a part of his cellular structure. It was the cruelest command he had ever received. More brutal than any sergeant's bark, more terrifying than the whistle of an incoming shell. It wasn't a gift. It was a life sentence. To carry this, to remember, to be the sole keeper of a story that no one would ever believe, and that he could never tell. He lay back on the ash-covered stones, the residual heat of the murdered city warming his back like a fever. He stared up at the poisoned sky, a dome of orange and black, empty of bombers now, empty of everything. The roaring was gone, replaced by a new sound, a low collective moan from the hundreds of survivors around him. the sound of a world exhaling its last breath. He was alive, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the Ardennes cold ever had, that the walking was over. The surviving was just beginning. This was only the first minute of the punishment. He was found 2 days later, not by Americans, by the Russians. Their T-34 tanks, coated in a slurry of mud and ash, crunched over the smoldering cobblestones, the red stars on their hulls looking like fresh wounds in the dawn light. The first Soviet scouts, boys with hard eyes and PPSH-41 submachine guns slung over their shoulders, found him. He wasn't hiding. He was just sitting on the bank of the Elbe, a hollow-eyed American grunt, his uniform in tatters, his face and hair caked in a fine gray powder. He was part of the landscape now. Another piece of rubble. One of them, a sergeant with a thick black mustache, nudged him with a boot. Jack looked up. The Russian said something he didn't understand, then gestured with his weapon. "Get up." Jack stood. He was lightheaded, empty. They didn't treat him like a prisoner. They treated him like a ghost. He was passed from unit to unit, a curious artifact of the collapsing Reich, a paperwork problem. He was liberated, they told him. The word had no meaning. Liberation suggested a return to something, but everything he had been before was gone, incinerated in that cellar. The journey east was a blur of boxcars and soup kitchens, of being pointed in one direction, then another. He was processed in Odessa, the Black Sea air sharp and clean, a mockery of the poison he'd inhaled. They put him on a boat, a liberty ship packed with other returning GIs. The mood was a foreign country to him. They laughed, they smoked, they played poker for fake money, their voices too loud, their eyes too bright with the future. Jack stood at the rail, day and night, watching the churn of the propellers in the dark water. He'd thrown his dog tags overboard one night, the faint plink lost in the ship's wake. The metal felt like a lie against his skin. It felt like the heat of the coal chute door. Finally, the debriefing. Clean, warm room somewhere in Virginia. An American officer with a crisp uniform and neatly combed hair sat across from him. The man's hands were soft. On the desk between them sat a steaming cup of coffee. The smell was rich, human. It made Jack's stomach turn. "So, Riley, you were at Stalag Fu B?" The officer didn't look up from his file. "Yes, sir." Jack's voice was a rusted hinge. "And then moved to Dresden for a work detail?" "Yes, sir." The officer finally looked at him, his eyes a neutral, bureaucratic blue. "Tell me about the bombing." Jack's gaze drifted from the man's face to the coffee cup. The porcelain was perfect, white. He thought of the cellar. The dust so thick you could taste it. The way it coated the back of your throat like a second skin. He thought of the sound. Not a bang, but a world-ending roar, a pressure that squeezed your organs and made your teeth ache. How could he explain the smell of burning phosphorus mixed with the sweet, sickly odor of cooked flesh? How could he describe the sight of melted glass flowing down the streets like water? How could he possibly articulate that the most profound terror of his life, the moment that carved him out and left him hollow, was delivered not by the enemy, but by the silver wings of his own country's bombers? He looked at his own hands resting on his knees. They were clean now, but the skin was still raw in places, the nails torn and permanently stained with soot. They were the hands that had failed to pull her from the shaft. "It was bad, sir," Jack said. The words were ash in his mouth. The officer nodded, scribbling a note in the margin of the file, a tiny insignificant mark. "We heard. Well, you're lucky to be alive, soldier." Lucky. The word bounced off him, meaningless. He wasn't lucky. Luck was random, a twist of fate. What had happened to him felt ordained, a specific and terrible punishment. He had been spared not by chance, but by her will. He was living on borrowed breath, on air she had forfeited. He was a debtor, and the debt was a life sentence. He looked at the officer's clean, capable hands, and knew the man would never understand. No one in this clean, bright country ever would. The war they had won was a simple story. The war he had survived was an unspeakable secret. He just looked at his own damaged hands and said nothing. He didn't feel lucky. He felt condemned. The trowel bit into the earth, a clean, soft sound. The soil in Ohio was rich and black, nothing like the frozen, rocky ground of the Ardennes or the ashen corpse dust of Dresden. Mary was on her knees a few feet away, her hands buried in a bag of mulch, placing the bare roots of a rose bush into a hole he'd dug. The sun was warm on the back of his neck. A bee droned past his ear. It was a perfect, quiet afternoon. "Hannah wants to go to the lake this weekend." Mary said, her voice muffled by the rustle of the plant's burlap wrapping. He nodded, plunging the trowel in again. The motion was rhythmic, hypnotic. Dig, lift, turn. A simple, honest task. This was the life he'd been supposed to want. The life he'd fought for. The life she had ordered him to live. The metal of the trowel hit a small stone with a clink. The sound was tiny, insignificant, but it was enough. It wasn't the clink of a tool on rock. It was the sound of a coal shovel striking brick in a dark, suffocating shaft. The rich, dark earth of the garden dissolved into the soot-choked air of a cellar. He remembered Anna talking about her small balcony, how she'd tried to grow tomatoes in a cracked porcelain pot, how the soot from the trains and the factory smoke always coated the leaves, turning them grey. They never got enough sun. She'd whispered in the dark, her voice a fragile thing against the roar outside. But I kept trying. It was something to care for. He stopped digging. His hand, clenched around the wooden handle of the trowel, went slack. The realization didn't come as a shock. It was a cold, slow certainty, like a stone settling in the pit of his stomach, a weight he had been carrying for 23 years without ever knowing its name. It wasn't the bombing that had destroyed him. The terror of the Jabos, the concussive hell of the firestorm, those were events. They scarred the body, they haunted the dreams, but they were the shared currency of every man who'd been there. It wasn't the cold of the Ardennes, the kind that froze the tears on Billy's cheeks. That was just misery, a physical trial. It was her. It was the 48 hours of impossible connection. It was the quiet humanity flourishing in the absolute heart of the apocalypse. In a world dedicated to annihilation, they had built a tiny, silent republic of two. It was her hand finding his in the absolute blackness, a small, warm anchor in a sea of screaming chaos. It was the way she'd said his name, Jack, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, as if they were meeting at a cafe, not in a tomb. It was the fact that she, a German nurse, had seen past the uniform, past the nationality, to the terrified boy inside, and had shown him a kindness so profound it felt like a physical wound. And he had failed to save her. The truth, stark and unbearable, finally surfaced. He had not built this life, this house, this wife, these children, this garden, after the war. He had built it all directly on top of her grave. Every shingle he'd nailed, every fence post he'd set, every bedtime story he'd read to Hannah, it was all just a layer of topsoil packed over the place where she had ceased to be. This peaceful suburban existence was the headstone he had erected for Anna. He was living for two people. The weight of it was crushing, a constant gravitational pull on his soul. Every smile he gave Mary was a performance. Every laugh with his children was an echo. He was a curator of a museum dedicated to a life he wasn't truly living, while the real man, the one forged in fire and sealed in a coal chute, remained underground, forever holding a woman's hand in the dark. Mary looked up, sensing the change in his rhythm. "Jack, you okay? Your hands are shaking." He looked down. They were. The calloused, capable hands of a husband and father were trembling like the hands of the boy he'd been, clinging to an iron rung as the world burned. He forced them to be still. "Just tired," he murmured, the lie as familiar as his own face in the mirror. "The sun's warm." He picked up the trowel again. He forced it back into the earth. Dig, lift, turn. He was building the garden, tending the roses, living the life. He was following his final order. But as he worked, he knew he was just a ghost, haunting the beautiful, peaceful world he had built over his own heart. A prisoner of the one perfect thing the war had given him, just before it took everything else away. The boat ride home. 1945. The USS General M.L. Hersey cut through the gray Atlantic swells. It was a victory ship, but there was no victory in the water, only the endless, churning monotony of the journey. Below deck, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp, clean scent of Army-issue soap. The other GIs laughed, a raw, relieved sound. They smoked Luckies, dealt greasy cards onto wool blankets, their voices a steady hum of baseball stats and girls they couldn't wait to see. They were going home. They were already there, in their minds, sitting at their mother's kitchen tables, walking down Main Street. Jack stood at the rail alone. He'd found a spot far from the clusters of celebrating men. The salt spray stung his lips. He watched the propellers churn the ocean into a white, foaming wake. a road leading back to a world that no longer existed for him. He'd done it 3 days out of Le Havre, under the cover of a moonless night. He'd unclasped the 2 small stamped metal discs, the ones that were supposed to identify his body. He'd held them over the dark water, feeling their weight. They weren't heavy, but they carried the mass of a continent, of a city turned to ash. He couldn't stand the feeling of the metal on his skin anymore. In the cellar, pressed against Anna, the tags had grown hot, searing a phantom brand over his heart. Now the cold metal felt like a lie. It felt like her. It felt like the heat of the firestorm. He opened his hand. There was no splash. The ocean swallowed them without a sound. He'd lied to the clean-faced debriefing officer in Odessa. "Lost in the fire, sir." The officer had just nodded, making a note. It was the first brick in the fortress. He was already building the fortress of silence he would live inside for the rest of his life, stone by heavy stone. Every unasked question from his family, every concerned look from a future friend, would be another block mortared into place. The fortress had a single silent occupant, the memory of a woman whose face he could barely see, but whose voice was etched into his bones. Then the morning it happened. A cry went up, a collective intake of breath from 500 men. "There, I see it." The fog was lifting, and a weak sun broke through, glinting off a distant greenish copper. The Statue of Liberty. A roar went up from the deck, a wave of pure, uncomplicated joy that washed over the ship. Men hugged, pounded each other on the back, some openly wept with relief. Hats were thrown into the air. They were home. Jack didn't cheer. He didn't move. He just shielded his eyes with a hand that still felt raw from clawing up a coal chute. The statue was just a silhouette, a symbol from a history book. It meant nothing to the man he had become. The cheers around him felt like a physical pressure, pushing him down. He wasn't returning from the war. He was bringing the war home with him. He was carrying it in his lungs, in the taste of plaster dust that would never leave his tongue, in the sound of a firestorm that now lived where his heartbeat should be. He was a cargo ship of ghosts, docking in a New York harbor that was blindingly, painfully alive. He looked at the celebrating men. They were shedding their uniforms in their minds, becoming farmers, mechanics, husbands. He knew he would do the same. He would put on the civilian clothes, learn the rituals, speak the language. But it would all be a disguise. The real Jack Riley had stayed behind, in a stone cellar under a burning city. The man on this boat was a changeling, an empty vessel following the last order he'd ever been given: live. The ship's horn blasted, a triumphant, deafening sound that shook the very deck. The men cheered louder. Jack flinched, the sound tearing through him like shrapnel. It wasn't a sound of homecoming. It was a final screaming echo of the bombs, a last reminder that the quiet he craved was just an illusion. The war wasn't over. It had just changed theaters. The battlefield was now the landscape of his own mind, and he was the only soldier left, fighting a battle he could never win, for a woman he could never save. He turned his back on the statue and looked east, toward the horizon he'd just left behind. He was going home, but home was the one place he knew he could never reach. He was an old man at 45. The porch swing creaked a familiar, tired rhythm. The Ohio sunset bled orange and purple, the kind of peaceful dusk he'd once dreamed of in a frozen foxhole. He watched the fireflies blink on and off over the lawn, little silent flares in the gathering dark. Feuersturm. The word came to him not as a memory but as a taste. Ashes. It was always ashes. He had survived the physical fire. He had lived. He had done exactly what she had commanded him to do. He'd come home to a nation of bright, bustling victory, married Mary, sweet, solid Mary who had waited and built this house with his own 2 hands. He'd fathered 2 children, held a job at the parts factory for 20 years, mowed his lawn on Saturdays. He was a good husband, a good father, a good man by any measure the world could see. But the war had not been a place he visited. It was a thing that had remade him, cell by cell, into a different species of man. The one who came back was a careful replica, a forgery built over a fault line. Every time he struck a match to light his wife's birthday candles, the tiny scrape hiss was a trigger. The garage would vanish. The smell of sulfur and burning pine became the smell of a world on fire. He was no longer in Ohio, but back in the cellar, the air so thick with plaster dust he could taste the walls. He could feel the vibration of the bombs through the stone floor, a deep, intestinal groan that started in the earth and climbed up his spine into his teeth. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, an ambulance racing down the state road, a fire truck heading into town, his heart would clench into a cold, hard fist. For a split second, it wasn't a siren. It was the air raid alarm, that rising, falling keen that meant the sky was about to tear open. He'd stop whatever he was doing, his body rigid, waiting for the first concussive thud of the high-explosive cookies. The sound never came, only the hum of the refrigerator or the chatter of the television. The silence afterward was somehow worse, and every time Mary reached for him in the dark of their bedroom, her touch, meant to be gentle, to be loving, was a brand. Her hand on his arm was Anna's hand, small and frantic, finding his wrist in the absolute blackness. Her body curled against his back in sleep was the shape of Anna's shoulder, pressed against him as the world ended above them. He would lie there, rigid, barely breathing until the feeling passed, and he was just a man in bed with his wife. The guilt would then wash over him, hot and shameful. He loved Mary, he did, but he was haunted by a ghost whose face he could barely see, whose voice was an echo in a chamber of collapsing stone. He realized, sitting on that porch as the last light failed, that the firestorm of Dresden had never truly ended. It had simply changed form. The external inferno, the one that melted streets and sucked the oxygen from a city, had burned itself out in a matter of hours. The internal one had banked its coals. It had gotten quieter, subtler, and moved inside him. It lived in the hollow of his chest, a low, constant heat that flared with a scent, a sound, a touch. He had carried it back across the Atlantic on the troop ship, a stowaway in his own soul. He had carried it through his wedding day, a faint smell of smoke on his best suit. He had carried it into the delivery room when his son was born. The memory of another kind of screaming, just beneath the joyful ones. He had built his entire life, the white picket fence, the rose bushes, the two-car garage, atop the epicenter of that personal, perpetual firestorm. The world saw a veteran, a family man, a solid citizen. He saw a caretaker of a grave he could never visit, a man living a life that was meant for two. He had followed her last order, live, but she had never told him how to do it. She never said how to quiet the roar, how to forget the feel of her hand letting go, how to stop listening for a voice that had been silenced by his own country's bombs. The fireflies pulsed in the twilight, on, off, like distant muzzle flashes, like the last flickers of a city dying. He closed his eyes. The firestorm was quiet tonight, just a dull, familiar warmth behind his ribs, but he knew it was always there, waiting for a breeze, a memory, a dream, to fan it back into a blaze. He looks at his hands. They are old hands. They built a house. They held his children. But they are still the hands that clawed their way out of that coal chute. They are the hands that failed to reach her. He survived the bombs. He survived the capture. He survived the cold. He even survived the peace. But he never survived the memory. Not the memory of the fire, the memory of her kindness. The impossible human kindness that she showed an enemy, just before his own people erased her. That was the wound, the one that never healed. He stands up from the porch swing. The chains groan a familiar protest. It's dark now. The crickets are loud, a chorus of peacetime he never learned to trust. He looks up at the stars, cold and sharp in the Ohio black. And for a moment he's not in Ohio. He's in the ashes, looking up at a sky empty of bombers, and he is still waiting. The memory comes not as a storm, but as a slow rising tide. It starts with the silence after the second wave. The American planes were gone. The British were gone. The only sound was the crackle of a world on fire. He was on his knees, his raw hands pressed against the hot iron of the sealed chute. He screamed her name until his throat was ragged, but the word was swallowed by the roar. It was a sound that didn't allow for hope. It was the sound of a city being unmade. He remembers stumbling away. The heat had warped the air, making the ruins shimmer. He passed a streetcar, melted into a sculpture of blackened metal and glass. He saw shapes in the doorways that used to be people. They were reduced to charcoal sketches, their final poses frozen in a last, desperate reach for air. He kept walking. He didn't know where. His uniform was in tatters, his face a mask of soot and dried blood. He was a ghost among ghosts. A woman, her clothes mostly burned away, sat on a pile of rubble, cradling a china teacup. It was pristine. She was rocking back and forth, humming a lullaby to the empty cup. She looked at him as he passed, her eyes wide and unblinking. She held out the cup. "Wasser?" she whispered. "Water." He shook his head, his own throat sealed shut with grief and ash. He had nothing to give. He was a hollow man. He found the river. The Elbe was clogged with debris and the dead. People were wading in, not to escape but to drink the filthy oil-slicked water. He collapsed on the bank, his body finally giving out. He lay there for hours or maybe days. Time had lost its meaning. He watched the great black pillar of smoke blot out the sun. It was a funeral pyre for 25,000 souls. For Ina. He thought of his dog tags, the metal discs that identified him as Jack Riley. ASN 365684112, B positive, Protestant. They had felt like a brand against his skin in the burning cellar. His identity, his side, the side that had done this. He fumbled for them now, his fingers clumsy. He wanted to rip them off, to throw them into the toxic river. But he couldn't. They were a part of the curse, to live. When the Russian soldiers found him, they didn't see an American. They saw another piece of wreckage. A young private with a submachine gun poked him with a boot. Jack looked up. The soldier said something in Russian, his face grim. He offered Jack a cigarette. Jack just stared. The soldier shrugged, lit the cigarette himself and took a long drag. The smell of cheap tobacco cut through the stench of death. It was the most human thing Jack had experienced in days. The liberation was a blur of paperwork and thin soup. On the troop ship home, the other men talked of girls and beer and their mother's apple pie. They played poker with worn decks of cards. They stood at the rail and cheered when someone spotted land. Jack stood at the rail too, but he looked down into the churning grey water. He thought about the dog tags again. One day when no one was looking, he slipped the chain over his head. He held the two small plates in his palm. They felt heavy. They felt like guilt. He let them fall. They disappeared into the wake without a sound. It felt like a betrayal, not of his country but of her. He was shedding the only proof that he had been there, that any of it had happened. Back on the porch, a car door slams down the street. The sound jerks him back to 1968, to Ohio, to the mortgage and the lawn that needs mowing. He can still feel the ghost weight of those tags around his neck. He can still feel the heat of her hand on his wrist. He had followed her order. He had lived. He had married a good woman. He had raised children who knew nothing of firestorms and coal chutes. He had built a life of quiet ritual. But the man who did those things was a carefully constructed shell. The real man, the one who was forged in that cellar, never left. He was still there in the dark, holding on to a stranger who became his entire world in 6 hours. He was still listening for her voice in the silence between the bombs. He looks at his hands one last time before going inside. They are clean now. They are a father's hands, a husband's hands. But under the skin, deep in the bone, he knows the truth. They will always be the hands that let go.